Good afternoon. My name is Mario Piombo, Director of Innovation at Napa Learns, and today I am joined by the wonderful Carla Surber. Carla, do you want to introduce yourself to our guests here?
Sure. I'm the College and Career Center Coordinator for Calistoga Joint Unified School District, and I'm also a Napa Learns Fellow.
Awesome. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us today.
Sure.
So we're creating this series of videos to really understand the impacts of distance learning, and specifically trying to collect stories from educators who are still able to push on and bring high quality learning experience to students. And technology is a huge part of the conversation as we look at distance learning. And so
Absolutely.
how do you think students have adapted or adjusted to distance learning in Calistoga? What have you seen so far?
I've seen an initial really positive response. They want the structure, they want to continue with school, but I've seen them kind of do the whole gamut in their responses. This week, the students I'm talking to are feeling overwhelmed. And they're at that place where they're like, what? One more digital tool I have to learn? One more login I have to memorize? Sort of like we feel, right? And so I think what I'm seeing my fellow educators do is take a step back and remember to put learning first and tech second, and to be really intentional in choosing the tech applications. I think on the back end of that we'll probably start having some conversations about tools that we're using, and if there's a particular set of tools that maybe we could focus on, and then use, sort of narrow the field a little bit so that we aren't asking kids to use so many different tools. And I've seen teachers just jump right in. Teachers with different levels of experience, teachers who'd never heard of Zoom are using Zoom now. They're either recording their lessons or they're doing live sessions with their students. So I think one of the real valuable lessons we've learned, and I don't think that a lot of people didn't already know this, was that it's not just about the tech access for the kids, especially given this current situation. They're scared, they're frustrated. The seniors are so sad and angry that the end of their senior year has been so disrupted, and who can blame them? And yet they're still putting, their next best step forward and moving forward. I feel like those of us who were able to go through the fellows program, we're better prepared, because we, in the program, I remember really focusing on that learning first and tech second, that we were learning how to use all of these innovative tools, but we were looking at the standards and the why, and looking at our curriculum and using those tools to enhance rather than replace instruction. And that's certainly how I use the digital tools in my role as the College and Career Center Coordinator. I don't have a lot of time with kids. I'm pushing into their other classes. So I've created the online resources to reinforce what we're doing when I am in their classroom. And I think a lot of teachers are kind of having to learn that on the fly, and that's challenging. But the Fellows program really helped prepare me to be strategic about how I'm using those tools, and reflective on how those tools are working, so that I can adjust as I go along. Because if it's not working for the kids, then it's not working, right? And I think during this challenging time, we need to remind ourselves that their social emotional education and development has got to come first. Because if they're not feeling safe and supported, they can't access the disciplinary or the content skills and knowledge that we need for them to hopefully be moving forward with, so that we're not losing a lot of ground during this event.
That's a really good point. And I think you hit the nail on the head that, if the technology is not working for students, then it's not working. And I think it's really easy to get caught up on trying to find the next best tool that's going to help you teach better online. But sometimes we move too quickly, and just as we can frustrate educators as we do that and implementing new tools, I think equally we can frustrate students who aren't used to having to adapt so quickly when it comes to technology.
Right.
What what do you see as the biggest challenge when it comes to students' individual needs and accessing technology? And have you seen major challenges, or are students being pretty resilient right now?
Students are being pretty resilient. I mean, a lot of it is just little tech glitches here and there, like a student not realizing that they needed to click on the little video camera. To all of those things that sort of slow us down can be a wall for kids, right? Especially when they're already overwhelmed socially and emotionally, to be persistent and have the grit to get through a stumbling block like that.
Yeah, I've thinking a lot about the graphic, the learning pit, and it's kind of like, and it kind of shows students like moving through different stages of productive struggle and that academic grit. And
right.
It's, along the way, you find these little things that allow you to continue to move forward, right? And until it becomes something that you can achieve with
right
that, and you can hopefully do it again every day. If it's something like logging into Zoom, then each one of those buttons, learning what it does, is going to get you one step further to pulling yourself out of the pit and being successful in your learning. You had also mentioned needing to take a step back in terms of students, or students needing to take a step back. What are they missing in terms, like what's not allowing them to move forward at that speed sometimes?
Well, I talked to a couple of seniors yesterday. We had a Zoom meeting to, actually it was kind of cool. We went through interview practice because they had an interview coming up for a scholarship. So I'm still doing those employability skill workshops in Zoom.
Awesome.
And they felt like they'd gotten to a place where now they know how to access their classes, now they know how to access the material, but now they're questioning the value of the material that they're actually getting. So when you talk about that pit, I feel like they're kind of climbing out of that, and they're like, okay, where's the rigor, right? So it's that challenge to keep, because usually by the time kids are in high school, we're mostly focused on content. We've taught them the disciplinary literacy, right? So they've got the writing and reading and analysis and listening and speaking skills, and we're focused mostly on content. So for the first couple of weeks of this, we had to go back to, how do you access things? The sort of nuts and bolts of how do we do this thing that we're now calling distance learning. And so the content got a little soft, maybe. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
And so now they're frustrated because they're worried about college and will they be prepared. And I know that their teachers are responding to that and that the rigor will come, but it's interesting to see their sense of this, them being the students, their sense around what that looks and feels like.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I've heard that from a couple people in terms of students not engaging because they feel like the content isn't quite there, and what are they doing? And I think it takes so much work to prepare this content digitally that I think that's the other end of it, is there's definitely not a lot of empathy from the student to the teacher for having to create the content and figure out, what am I going to do? How am I going to totally pivot and bring everything online? And so a lot of times it's hard to wade through the content and figure out exactly how you're going to rework something to be digital. And I could definitely see why students question that, especially if they're trying to stay engaged and maybe it's not engaging enough.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and in the classroom, I can tell when they're losing engagement because I'm going too slow, or where I've left them behind because I'm going too fast. But we don't have that interaction necessarily online, so it's hard to tell. And you don't want to leave them behind, right? So yeah, it's a challenge.
Yeah. I also want to give people and I probably should have asked it on the front end, but I can ask it now. Can you give us a snapshot of what your day looked like before all this happened? And you're in a very unique role in Calistoga. And so what is your role on a day-to-day basis? And how does that translate now to distance learning?
So my role on a day-to-day basis is planning for creating and then preparing to present workshops to students, either pushing into their advisory class and working with them through Naviance tasks, or creating or utilizing work-based or work readiness resources. So workshops mostly. And beyond that, meeting with individual students or small groups of students or parents to talk about career exploration and college applications or post-secondary educational options. So transitioning to distance learning has been challenging. One, my workshops I've just had to put out there in my Google Classroom, but the students don't really have time in their day to do it, and I'm not taking over someone else's class. So I'm worried about whether or not, I like having it there for them as an opportunity, and I know some will plug in and do it, but I'm worried about making sure that they all have that experience. And we'll get there. I'll figure out a way to make it up to them whenever we're able to return. And then the other thing, and this has been a hard one for me, is those meetings with students. So I can email them, or I can send them a remind message, or, just to give you an example, the seniors right now, a lot of them have their financial aid awards sitting in their portals for the universities. So one of the things I typically do is have them come in and we go through those awards together and we compare the colleges so that they and their families can make an educated decision based on financial aid. So I've been reaching out to parents and students and inviting them to make an appointment with me to go over with that. And not a lot of them are doing it. And I'm nervous about that. And I'm worried about their emotional well-being. I think a lot of them are feeling like, I'm hearing it, that, it's going to be distance learning for college anyway. I'm not sure I want to do that. They're teenagers, so they're making plans based on what ifs. And I'm struggling to create the connection with them and create the time to sit down and have that conversation with them. And what I'm finding is when I can wrangle them in and we can do a Zoom and they can show me their portals, they seem to leave those meetings with a much clearer idea of what the possibilities are. And they've even said, I feel better about this now. So, but if we were at school, I'd be sending a call slip and their teacher would say, go see Surber now. And if they didn't come and see me, I'd go find them during break. So just making those connections is what's been challenging for me.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely based on relationships, the kind of work that you do, and getting to know students individually, and it's much more intimate than, a traditional teaching and learning environment.
Right.
What have been the biggest surprises that you didn't anticipate, and how have you adjusted to them?
Biggest surprises for me?
Yeah.
In my work with kids, I was at first surprised that they weren't responding to my emails. That's not typical, right? But then as I began to talk to them, I realized that they're just overwhelmed with emails. Every time anything gets posted in one of their Google Classrooms, they get an email. And they'll say things like, I just don't want to get off the couch.
Right.
I just don't want to do anything. And that's all understandable, right? So just figuring out a way to change what I do in a way, to start that conversation with, it's okay that you're angry that your senior year's getting screwed up. I would be too. Give them permission to have the feelings they're having, because they also feel bad, right? Because they're healthy and no one in their family's gotten sick. So they feel like they're being selfish. Yeah. Kids are so amazing.
On that note too, how are you supporting students that are, emotionally struggling in that way? Have you guys provided any kind of support for students?
Our guidance counselor, Michelle, has done an amazing job of setting up Google Classrooms by grade level. But then she's also set up just a counseling Google Classroom where she's giving all kinds of online resources that she's vetting. And that pushes kids into an even more online virtual reality. And of course, what they're missing is the human contact. They can't even go see their friends. So, but she's also calling kids. we're conferencing about students that we're worried about. I talked to a student the other day who thought we were all going back to school on May 1st. Like, oh, how do we make sure that they know all that follow-up to make sure that people are getting the message and that they understand the message.
Right? It
Right?
sounds like you have some nice safety nets too and ways to communicate with students individually, which is really awesome.
Absolutely. So one of the things our admin team has done is put together a spreadsheet, and teachers pop in there and put in the name of the student they're worried about and indicate what they've been doing to try to work with that student. And I know that our office staff and our admin team are calling families every day. We're really fortunate that we have such a small population and we can do that. Of course, I guess bigger schools have more folks to do that work, but in a meeting I had this morning with colleagues, the principal talked about how he called a student yesterday and the student was just so happy to hear from him.
It sounds like you have, would you say you have a pretty good amount of participation by students?
Yes, initially a lot, and then they fell off a little bit, and I think they're coming back now. You know, part of what kids are trying to figure out too is what is credit, no credit? What does that mean? What does hold harmless mean in terms of grades? So I think there's just been a sort of settling in and figuring out what all this means phase, and then I think we're kind of getting back to the work at hand.
How important is it for students to be able to connect with one another digitally? Have you seen success in that as well?
So when I've hosted just a few meetings that included more than one student, and they talk to each other and they seem to really enjoy. In fact, the meeting that I had yesterday, I just invited them to check in with each other at the beginning of the Zoom meeting. In fact, I was in an online culturally relevant teaching and learning workshop this morning through Avid. And one of the things that the host pointed out was when they get to the Zoom classroom, be sure to give them time to check in. They need to be able to check in with each other. So, yeah.
You mentioned too grading with pass, no pass, and hold harmless. Can you explain to people who might not be familiar with grading, like our donors who might be watching, how grading has changed in assessment?
Sure. Yeah. So this sort of came to us from the state and the four-year institutions, California State Universities and University of California, who decided that for the seniors and other students who are working on their A through G requirements, their college entrance requirements, that they would accept pass or credit grades for this semester. And that rather than traditional letter grades A through C, which impact an overall GPA. So then the district has moved to adopt that credit, no credit for all grade levels. But in addition to that, the idea of hold harmless is if a student entered this event with a passing grade, they cannot go backwards. They can improve that grade, but they cannot lose ground. And if they came into this with a failing grade, then they can improve that grade. So the reasoning behind that is that we simply cannot ensure that students have equitable access to not just the technology, but the curriculum. We don't know what's going on in children's homes. We don't know if, parents have turned into homeschool teachers. Do they have a quiet place to work? I was in a meeting the other day with a student who did not have a quiet place to work. She was on her tablet and there was a lot going on in the background and we got through it, but it was really hard for her. So we just need to make sure that whatever we're doing in terms of grading isn't going to create an equity gap that wasn't there before this happened.
Yeah, and on that note, what do you think the biggest challenges to implementing distance learning are for the students specifically? Are there barriers that are at play right now?
Sure. In our district, I don't know what other districts in the Valley have done, but we handed out, I think it was 70 hotspot devices so that students would have internet access in their homes. That was a gift from the Rotary. That's pretty amazing. And then we also checked out Chromebooks to all families that needed one. And thanks to Napa Learns, we have enough of those that we could even send more than one home to a family, right? Because we have them in every single classroom. I know of districts where families got to check out one Chromebook. You got 3 kids in the home all trying to use the same Chromebook. How does that work, right? So first we dealt with that access piece of it, right? But then, like I said earlier, the student who literally, for his teacher, had to turn his Chromebook around so she could see the screen. Now, how did he do that? Oh, I guess he did his phone. I don't know what he did. Maybe he shared his screen so that she could see that he had not clicked on the video icon, right?
Right.
So there are those little stumbling blocks that they're running into. And then I would say there's a lot of checking for understanding that we can't do in a distance learning model. So with our long-term language learners, how are we able to make sure that they're actually engaged in and accessing the curriculum? What additional supports do they need? So I think that differentiation that students and scaffolding that students might be more accustomed to in the classroom, that's another piece that we're still in the process of trying to figure out. How do we differentiate for students who aren't right in the room with us? I mean, and in a lot of ways, I think that can be, and this is something I learned in the fellows program, in a lot of ways, if you know what those resources are, that can kind of even be easier, right? Because you can be pushing out different resources to different kids. But if you're not used to doing distance learning, that can be a pretty steep learning curve.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of brings me to this question too of, you know, you've mentioned in various ways how the fellows program has prepared you. What was your focus, you know, in the program, and how has that translated into solutions that you're now using in distance learning?
Yes. So my focus in the program was using online tools for writing instruction, specifically struggling writers, because I was intrigued by the fact that they were all on, at the time it was Facebook. Some of the newer social media platforms weren't even around then. They would write or texting each other. They'd write and write and write and write and write. But if I gave them a writing assignment in class, no thanks. So using, I think Edmodo was one of the first ones I used, where they could post questions and responses to each other. And, you know, they were so comfortable in that environment. So I think that still plays a role. They're digital natives. They're comfortable using apps, but it's about creating the structure to ensure that the learning, right? So learning first, tech second. How do we take advantage of these digital tools that they're drawn to, but make sure that what they're learning with those tools is meaningful?
Absolutely. You talked a little too earlier about differentiation, and I know that, and it sounds like the solution with Edmodo is differentiation. And can you explain for people who might not be familiar with differentiation and scaffolding, you know, what is it and how does technology help with it?
So scaffolding is about meeting a student where they are, and like literally building that scaffold to get them to where they need to be, right? And not all students need the same amount of scaffolding. Some students walk into your classroom with the, you know, the sort of academic skills that they need to just immediately engage with content. And a lot of students don't, and they need a bridge sort of, or scaffolding to get there. Differentiation is when you provide different opportunities for students based on where they are right now. Different opportunities to show what they've learned and what they know. So a student who might be reluctant to speak up in class, you'd be sure to provide an opportunity for them to comment on an Edmodo post, right? They all have something to say, but we have to make sure that we give them an opportunity to say it in a way that is meaningful for them, but also safe, right?
Absolutely.
So that's just one example of differentiation. There are more sort of academically traditional differentiations, which are if you do this up to this point on this assignment, you can earn a C. But if you do up to this point on an assignment, you can earn an A. So the student has voice and choice about what they're going to do on that assignment, and they can pass either way. But the student who's ready for more of a challenge can access that challenge, and the student who's not ready for that challenge can still succeed on the assignment.
That's great. Thank you for clarifying that. So my last question would be, what do you see as a silver lining or any positive outcomes that might come from having to implement distance learning the way we have? Do you see any things that you think may stick in the system?
I really do. I think that it's forced a lot of us who may have been reluctant to even use technology to jump into that pool, and then that's a good thing, because there is a place for it even when we're able to meet face to face. I think another silver lining is that it's also causing us to sort of reboot education as we know it. We're having to reevaluate our content and how our expectations. And I don't know, I've been in a couple of staff meetings recently where people have just commented on how they feel their teaching is so invigorated or reinvigorated because they've had to really dig in and look at, okay, I've done this lesson this way for 6 years now. I have to do it differently now. And whenever we reflect on how we're doing something in order to modify it or improve it, it's a good thing.
Absolutely. Everyone's leveling up, including the students and the teachers included, right?
Yes.
And
yeah.
probably the parents.
Yeah. I hope a silver lining for students will be that they become empowered to, and parents too, that they become empowered to own their own education. I'm worried about those kids who aren't empowered and who maybe have not been engaged and who don't re-engage this year. But I think for those who are able to do that, that it will be a really empowering experience.
That's awesome. Well, on that note, thanks for joining me today and giving us a preview into the life of a college and career readiness coordinator at a high school in Calistoga.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.